So, as Rodrigo mentioned, my background is a mixture of computer science and psychology. And so for many years, people told me that this was a bit of a strange combination. But I think this is a room I don't have to point out to you that things have really changed over the past few years. And increasingly, everything we're doing is generating data. So at Warwick, I have the huge honour of directing the data science lab alongside my colleague Tobias Price. We're very happy to count amongst our members Seresinhe and Marva Lanula, who are both here today as they're now also part of the Turing as part of the enrichment year scheme. And in the data science lab, what we are interested in is data from the internet. So for example, data on things that people might be looking for on Google or Wikipedia, or data on photographs that people might take and upload to services like Flickr or Instagram. Or equally, data that people might end up leaving behind by just playing games on the internet. And what we want to know is whether we can use this data to measure and possibly even predict human behaviour. Now, I think it also goes without saying that there are many areas of life where it would be incredibly helpful if we had a better idea of what people were going to do next. And we've looked at a few, but an obvious example perhaps is the stock markets. Now, what happens in the stock markets doesn't just affect the traders. If you think of the big crash back in 2008, that had repercussions for people around the world. And so whilst data from the financial markets has proved interesting to scientists of many ilks for quite a while now, my colleagues Tobias Price, Stanley and I, we began to wonder if data from the internet might not provide us with a new perspective on what was happening in these markets. Now, I think a parallel to something Andrew was saying, if you consider why people often look for information on the internet, it's reasonable to suppose that a lot of the time they want that information to try and inform actions that they might take afterwards. And so what we wanted to know was whether there might be a relationship between data on what people were looking for online and actions that they subsequently took in the stock markets. So to investigate this idea, in one of these studies, we considered data which Wikipedia makes available on pages that people have been looking at. So this starts back at the end of 2007, and this is a study that we ran towards the beginning of 2012. And to investigate this hypothesis, what we did is we created a hypothetical trading strategy using the data from Wikipedia to trade on the Dow Jones Industrial Average. And this is how the strategy worked. So we'd consider a page. So for example, the page on Bank of America. And we'd look at how often people had looked at that page in week T. And we'd then compare that to how often people had looked at that page in the previous few weeks. And if we saw that people had looked at that page less in week T than the previous few weeks, then we'd buy stock at the beginning of week T+1 and sell it back a week later. If we found instead that the page views had gone up, then we'd sell stock at the beginning of week T+1 and buy it back a week later. So we didn't just consider data from the Bank of America page, and we looked at pages relating to all 30 companies who were listed in the Dow Jones at the time. So for example, JP Morgan or IBM. And we gathered the data from all of their Wikipedia pages and looked at what happened if we implemented this strategy. And what we found was that increases in people looking at these pages tended to be related to subsequent stock market falls a week later. So you can see the results of that strategy captured in blue here. Now, at the time, we were very lucky. We were working with a fantastic PhD student. His name was Chester Curme, now Dr. Chester Curme. And Chester said, well, you know, we don't just have information on what people are looking for on Wikipedia, but we know how often people have been editing these pages too. So could we not take that information and put that into the trading strategy as well? So Chester went off, he collected this information, he put it into the trading strategy I described to you before, and we had a look at what happened. And the results from that you can see in red. And the answer is that we didn't really find any difference in the performance of a strategy based on Wikipedia edits and a strategy that just randomly chose to buy or to sell each week. Well, you can see the performance for that in grey. Now, there's a number of reasons this might be the case. I'm sure if you all reflect on your previous usage of Wikipedia, you're not going to be very surprised to hear that we have much more data on how often people have looked at these pages than how often people have edited these pages. But I suppose another possibility we might want to take into account is that there's potentially a big disconnect between people who are editing these pages and people who then affect stock market moves subsequently. So we were quite excited about this, what came through from 30 pages, but we did wonder, might this hold for a larger set of pages? And so we considered data from 285 pages that Wikipedia editors had labelled as relating to general economic concepts. So the page on capital or macroeconomics or wealth, for example. And we took the data from that larger set of pages and we put it into the strategy that I described to you before. And what we found was this. Again, increases in people looking at those pages tended to be followed by stock market falls, whereas there wasn't really any sort of useful relationship for the edit data. Indeed, a lot of the time there was just so little edit data that the strategy couldn't act at all. So this was good, but we're scientists, so we had to ask ourselves, is there some chance we're just kidding ourselves? If we just take data from another group of random 285 pages and we stick it in, are we going to see exactly the same? Because that wouldn't make an awful lot of sense. And so to investigate this, we considered data from a completely, in our mind, financially unrelated set of pages. So pages on actors and filmmakers, so Brad Pitt or Angelina Jolie. And we took that data and we put it into the strategy. And what we found was this. So absolutely nothing. So essentially, if you try and trade on how often people have been looking at the Brad Pitt page, then you're not going to do any better or any differently than if you've just been trying to choose to buy or sell on a random basis each week. So it seems that the content of the page really matters. And this is in line with analyses that we've carried out subsequently, for example, using Google data and trying to identify topics that people might search for before stock market falls. So I suppose one question that's left is why you might see an increase in people searching for information before stock market falls. Now, we can't provide a definitive answer to that, of course, but one possibility that we've considered is that there might be a relationship between the pattern that we see in the data and something that we've known about in psychology for a very long time, and that's called loss aversion. So we know that people care much more about losing £5 than they do about missing out on gaining £5, even though in both cases you end up £5 worse off. And we also know that it's clear that people invest more time in looking for information when they're making decisions that matter more to them. So if you think of what you do when you're buying a new car and you compare it to the information you're going to look for before you buy a new sandwich, then you get a sense of the kinds of differences you might see. And so one possible explanation is that what we're capturing here is an increase in people looking for information before they make a decision to sell stocks at a price lower than what they believe them to be worth. So a decision they think will be of greater impact. So predicting human behaviour is one challenge, but to be quite honest, a lot of the time we don't really have an excellent grasp of what's going on right now. And so this tremendous challenge of trying to measure human behaviour at a societal scale is something that, in many ways, we've often left to the Office for National Statistics. So, to give you an example of one of the very many things that they have done in this area over the years, you might want to think to times you may have spent in UK airports. Now, those of you who've flown in and out of UK airports often enough, you might at some point have been grabbed by somebody with a clipboard who wanted to know where you spent the last 12 months. Now, if you have been through that, you might have seen the stands there, even if nobody approached you. That will have been part of the International Passenger Survey, which is one of the many surveys that the Office for National Statistics carry out. And they carry out this survey to try and understand where tourists to the UK come from every year. So, Tobias and I, and colleagues Daniele Barchiesi from UCL, Christian Ellis and Stephen Bishop, we're reflecting on this, and we were also thinking about this map. Now, this map is a map created just by plotting the location of 32 million photographs that Flickr users took and uploaded over the period of a year. And so potentially, these dots don't only tell us where Flickr users were when they took the photographs, but if they're sticking a camera in their pocket when they go on holiday, it's arguably also telling us, where they're going. And so we wondered, is there no chance that we might be able to use this data to estimate what the Office for National Statistics had been trying to capture with their clipboards? And so, what we did to try and investigate this was to find people who had taken photographs in the United Kingdom and then work out where they had taken photographs over the past 12 months. So instead of asking them, we try and infer it from the data set. Now, we make a huge simplification in doing this. If we see somebody's taken a photograph in a particular country, and we then find that they've taken a photograph in another country later on, then we assume that they stayed in the first country until we saw a photograph in the other country. So obviously a simplification, but we wondered how far might this sort of estimate get us? And the answer is quite a long way. So if we compare the estimates we come up with of how many people are visiting the UK each year, and we look at how that lines up with what the Office for National Statistics were collecting with the International Passenger Survey, we see that there's a reasonable correspondence. And if you dig further into the figures, then you find that the International Passenger Survey does manage to reach 40,000 people per year. But we've actually got 15,000 people per year for free, just looking at the Flickr data. So we remain in awe of all of the work that the Office for National Statistics have done over the years in trying to capture what's going on through society. And so we are delighted to work with them on these problems, both at Warwick and we hope as part of the developing relationship between the Turing Institute and the Office for National Statistics Data Science Campus. So we were excited by this, but you could argue that we'd left out the most interesting part of the data here, and that's the photograph itself. So if you consider this photograph, this is a picture of the Lake District. Now, I grew up near the Lake District, and I used to really enjoy spending time there because it was beautiful, and just being in this location would somehow make me feel better. Up there in the corner, that's Chanuki, who I mentioned before. So Chanuki, before she started working as a doctoral researcher at Warwick and now here in the Turing, she had a very extensive career, including all sorts of things, amongst which she ran her own design studio. And so you can imagine that Chanuki has a real sense of the potential impact of what the world looks like on our everyday existence. So Chanuki, Tobias and I, we were looking at this, these pictures like this, and we were wondering whether there might not be a possibility to try and quantify the relationship between what a place looks like and our everyday well-being, building on all of these photographs that people are now leaving behind. I think the sad truth, or the reality of the matter, is of course that we don't all spend our time in places like this. And so maybe the more important question is how the impact of how the way in which a place in which we live or work might affect how healthy we feel we are. And so luckily, again, thanks to the Office for National Statistics, we do have good data on how healthy people are in the places in which they live. So there's a census every 10 years, I'm sure most of you are aware of this. And one of the questions on this census asks people to rate their health. So you can pick everything from very bad to very good. And we have to transform this data. So you can imagine, unfortunately, older people tend to report that they're less healthy. And there's a difference between men and women as well. But so once we've taken data we have on the local population into account and used that to transform the data, you can plot it. And it looks like this. So lighter areas are areas where people have reported their health to be worse, and darker areas are areas where people have reported their health to be better. And so just by looking at this map, you see some obvious patterns emerge. So around cities, people tend to report their health to be worse. And then further away from the cities, we're seeing better reports of health overall. So that's the health data. But how are we going to measure how attractive an area is at the same sort of scale? Now, this is a challenge that has left researchers stuck for many years. But thankfully, the answer came to us in the shape of a game that was set up by My Society in 2009. And the game is called Scenic or Not. So Scenic or Not shows people pictures like this and asks them to rate them between 1 and 10. So if you think it's a very scenic picture, you can rate it 10. If you don't think it's very scenic, you can rate it 1, or you can pick something in between. And in turn, these pictures come from another game called Geograph. So Geograph is a game where people are asked to take photographs around the country, and you get a point for every kilometre squared of the country that you've managed to upload a photograph in. And so building on data both from Geograph and Scenic or Not, we have ratings for over 200,000 places across the UK based on over 1.5 million votes. And so we can plot that data as well, and it looks like this. So up in the north, you can see the Lake District. So it's been rated as very scenic, so everybody agrees with me. And you can also see other patterns. So down towards where we know London is, the ratings aren't looking as good. And so what we wondered is what would happen if we combined that data with the data on health. And the answer is that people who live in areas rated as more scenic report their health to be better. Now, if you've just been looking at those last two maps, you are probably thinking, hang on a minute, that's incredibly trivial. You know, we saw that people in cities were not reporting their health to be as good. And at the same time, we've seen that cities are not rated as scenic. So surely this is just a matter of whether people live in the city or not. Now, we did wonder that too. So we split England into urban areas, suburban areas, and rural areas, and investigated whether this relationship held in those areas on their own. And what we were very interested to see is that it does. So, for example, even if you just look at urban areas, then the relationship still holds. Now, even with that out of the way, another thing you might wonder is, well, okay, fine, it works in cities, but maybe this is just something very simple about income. You know, so perhaps if people have got greater income, they can draw on that income to improve their health, and at the same time, they can use some of that income to choose a place to live, which is more scenic, and so that's all that's going on. So again, thanks to the Office for National Statistics, we do have excellent measures of income and all sorts of other socioeconomic variables. And so you can take that data too, put it into the model, and what you see is that while there is unfortunately a relationship between income and health, it's still not enough to explain this relationship. A final thing you might wonder is, looking at that picture behind of the Lake District, whether we might not have just found a really complicated way of measuring how green places are. So this might be beautiful, but it is fairly indisputably also incredibly green. And so we wanted to know, well, you know, what's the relationship then between how scenic a place looks and how green a place is, and might this explain what we've seen? Now, thankfully, we have been able to measure how green places are for much longer than we've been able to measure how scenic they are, you can draw on aerial imagery. So you can take aerial pictures of a place and you can work out how much of these places are covered in green space. And so if we take that data and plot it, it looks like this. And you'll see again up in the north, the Lake District's very green. We could have worked that out for ourselves. But if you compare it directly to the Scenicness map, then you see that while there are some clear similarities, for example, around the Lake District, there's also some differences. So, for example, towards some of the east of England, you start seeing areas that are rated quite highly in terms of green space, but they're not necessarily doing as well in terms of scenicness. So what we wanted to know was which of these data sets might best explain the differences in how healthy people were. And so we built 3 different models. So in one model, we're trying to explain the differences in how healthy people are using the green space data. In another, we use the scenicness data. And in a third, we use both data sets together. And if you look at all of these models, while we find, as previous studies have, that there is a relationship between green space and health, the statistics suggest that we really can't be throwing away this data on scenicness. So, for example, if you consider the urban areas on their own, this analysis suggests that the model we have the most evidence for is the model that actually just looks at the scenicness data. So, I think this is very much the beginning of a research program that we're excited about and not the end. And there's all sorts of further questions that could be asked and that some of which we're in the progress of asking. But nevertheless, we are excited about this result as it appears to be an initial piece of evidence that the aesthetics of a place we live in might not be just a nice to have, but might be vital for something as important as our health. So, what are we interested in doing in bringing all of this to the Turing? So I think in order to try and find projects like this, we have to find questions about human behaviour where we can either infer something that we didn't know about human behaviour before, or where we can come up with metrics that might be useful, for example, to policymakers. And for that, we need interesting data sets, and we also need methodologies that will transform the data into answers to the questions that we're interested in. And we work with all sorts of data sets: time series data, spatial data, networks data, text data, and absolutely image data. And so one of the things we hope to achieve in being here is to work with those of you who are developing methodologies which allow us to say new things about these sorts of data sets, to identify projects where there are interesting both behavioural questions and methodological questions that we can bring together. So some of you we've already spoken to about this, but please come and chat if you would like to work on some of this. So, to summarise, I've shown you how data from what people are looking for on Google and Wikipedia, data on photos people are uploading, or data from games, might be able to help us get new insights into problems ranging all the way from anticipating stock market movements to understanding the impact of the appearance of the environment on our everyday health. And so those are just some examples of the results that our group here, both at Warwick Business School and now here at the Turing, have been finding that data from the internet might help us measure and possibly even predict human behaviour. Thank you very much.